You sure? You want me in the center?
Sit in the center. Yeah. That's good.
Okay, I think why don't we? Welcome everyone. I'm excited to be here. This is the very live event that I'm hosting at Carnegie in several years. It's really going here and to be able to do a book launch in person. My name is Feldstein. I'm a senior fellow in Carnegie's Policy, Conflict, and Governance. Pleasure to welcome Xinjiang, the state here. Political control. It tells a story that is born in Silicon Valley, in America's war on terror, and now is playing out in places like Xinjiang and many other parts of China and even the world. In that region, in Xinjiang in particular, China's leaders have built a dystopian police state using security forces armed with artificial intelligence, among other technologies. But there's a very different scenario that's playing out in other parts of China, such as Hangzhou, where artificial intelligence is being used to improve services, to help with rescue efforts, municipal services, and so forth. And so this book really kind of gets into those discrepancies between the two. So, what can we make of surveillance trends in China, and where are they leading the country? Josh and Liza do a great job of taking readers through a wide set of experiences, and I really am looking forward to a conversation with them. Let me give a few words quickly about each of the authors, about their backgrounds, before we turn it over to them to offer some words about the writing of the book and the research that it took to put it together. So first, Josh, to my left, I actually first bumped into him in Hong Kong in 2019. He's when I was researching my own book, he works for the Wall Street Journal. He's covered politics as a reporter in China for the Wall Street Journal for more than a decade before taking on his current role as Deputy Bureau Chief. He's led an investigative team that won a Gerald Loeb Award in 2018 for documenting the Communist Party's embrace of digital surveillance. Among the first of more than a dozen American reporters to be expelled from China in early 2020, but he has continued to work on China coverage from Seoul and Taipei. So that's some sort of accomplishment, I guess. He started traveling to China as a teenager, taking part in a first-of-its-kind U.S.-China high school exchange program in 1993. His co-author, Liza Lin, I've also got to know Liza extensively through many conversations we had prior to this book about AI surveillance and China's influence worldwide. She is a China correspondent also for the Wall Street Journal, based in Singapore. She's covered Asia for almost 15 years, with 8 of those years spent in Shanghai. She was part of the journal team with Josh that won the Loeb Award in 2018. Also contributed to the new coverage of Chinese leader Xi Jinping in 2020, a series that was named a finalist for Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting. Liza is a former Fulbright scholar as well. So for the run of show, what we're going to do today is I'm going to now turn it over to Josh and Liza to give brief remarks about the book. We'll then do a Q&A between us for about 25 minutes, and we'll then reserve the last 15 minutes for live audience questions. So think right now about some of the questions you might have, and we'll do that, and then we'll wrap up. So thank you again, and let me turn it over to, I think Josh will go first, and then over to Liza.
Okay. Do I need the mic, or do I just talk? Okay, I'm all good. All right. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming out. I know this is sort of a new thing in the post-COVID world. I actually go to in-person events, so it's great that you guys all came out. I think I'll just talk a little bit about the origins of the book, and then Liza will kind of sort of tell one particular story that we felt was particularly revealing. So the book basically began with the investigative series that Liza and I worked on, and that series started the way a lot of Wall Street Journal reporting starts, which is by following the money. At the time, in sort of around 2016, 2017, one thing that just in the bureau we'd been talking about and I'd been particularly interested in was a sort of reversal in the way that the Communist Party related to individual Chinese people. For decades after the death of Mao, under sort of Deng Xiaoping and subsequent leaders, the Communist Party had been steadily retreating from the personal lives of Chinese citizens, right? The idea was just, we'll let you live your lives, we'll let you get rich, just don't talk about politics, right? Don't push for democracy, especially after 1989, this was the arrangement, right? But under Xi Jinping, after he'd been the current leader, after he'd been in power for a few years, the party started to reverse that and was increasingly inserting itself into people's lives. So we knew this was a trend, but we didn't really know exactly how to get into it. And around that time, Liza, who was covering tech startups and looking at investment into new Chinese tech startups, noticed a bunch of money flowing into AI startups in China, and specifically AI startups that were working in this kind of obscure field of computer vision, which is the main application of which is facial recognition technology. And so she found there was one company in particular that was based in Beijing that was getting tons of money, in particular from American investors. And she called me up. She was based in Shanghai at the time. She called me up. I was in Beijing, and she's like, "I know you're interested in this, in surveillance. There's this company that seems to be doing a lot of it. Do you want to go check it out with me?" And so we went there. The company was called SenseTime. At the time, it was very obscure. No one had really heard of it. It then quickly, not too long after our coverage, became one of China's most valuable AI startup. And we went to their offices, and it was like walking into a sci-fi movie. If anyone's seen the movie Minority Report, you'll get a sense of it, right? It was like you scanned your face to get in. There were sort of mock advertisements that they had where it would scan your face and then determine how, like, whether you were male or female, how old you were, and then try to sell you products based on what it thought you were. There was a big screen where you had video footage, sort of cameras that were trained on the intersection outside the office, and they were labeling everything in the video in real time, right? So like they were labeling cars, what color car, what year car they thought it was, people, what color clothing they were wearing, whether they were male and female, that sort of thing. And we learned that was something that they were selling to police to be able to search surveillance footage. And so anyway, it was wild to see all of this, and we were, especially in 2017, back then all of this was really, really new. And we found out that they were selling this to police all over China. And we were like, this is amazing. Can't believe this is happening. So we took it back to our editors, and they agreed, and we did a story, it ran on the front page of the Journal, and that kicked off a whole series that eventually culminated in me and another Wall Street Journal colleague going to Xinjiang, which is this region in far northwestern China, about twice the size of Texas. It's home to about 14 million Turkic Muslim minorities. It's always been a bit of a difficult place for China to control. And we had heard at the time that rumors from people who'd been traveling there that there was tons of the surveillance technology that we'd been writing about being rolled out. And so we figured we'd just go check it out. No one really knew at that point what was actually happening there. And so we went in. Charles Hutzler is in the crowd here, who was our bureau chief at the time, wisely suggested that we drive in instead of fly so that we wouldn't be recognized in the airport, which we did. And as soon as we drove across the border into Xinjiang, it was kind of like driving into this, I always think of it as like kind of like a dystopian war zone, right? It was just cameras everywhere, sort of special forces, armed police with assault rifles, patrolling, and then just security checkpoints everywhere. Sort of every hour you drove, or or in the city, sort of every few blocks that you went. And it was just incredibly suffocating. It was just hard to believe this was actually a real thing. And they were using this technology to track Uyghurs and categorize them sort of according to the threat level that they presented. And it was just like, personally, I just remember every time going up to one of these security checkpoints, just kind of feeling the terror, right? And feeling my kind of heart thumping in my chest, and I'm just trying to imagine what it must be like for Uyghurs going through it. It was just, I hadn't actually ever imagined anything like this happening in the 21st century, right? So I think at that point, we did that story, and I think at that point I started, Liza and I talked, and we just realized that this was something that had sort of, was something really genuinely new, and it probably was something we needed a book to fully explore.
And I guess you guys have a ton of questions about what Josh has already said, and I just wanted to kind of paint a picture of the same surveillance system, but used in a very, very different way in China, and for very different purposes as well, and for purposes that are a lot less sinister, but actually, found some of the residents that I've talked to find the same surveillance systems used in different parts of China for different purposes very attractive and very alluring. So I guess in order to do that, I will now contrast Josh's story with my own experience. In late 2019, when it was still possible to travel into China before China shut down over COVID, I headed up to this city called Hangzhou. Hangzhou is probably people aren't as familiar with Hangzhou as they are with Shanghai or Beijing, but Hangzhou is a wealthy city on the East Coast, like a 2-hour drive from Shanghai. It's home to, this is probably a more familiar name, Alibaba, which is a big internet tech giant that many people know. And it's also home to Hikvision and Dahua, which is the world's 2 largest surveillance camera makers. So for that reason, Hangzhou is a city that's very embracing of such technology, because that sort of technology has helped the city succeed. And the way they embraced that technology was in city government services to help keep streets clean, for example, to help keep law and order on the streets, or just regular street management, right? So one of the systems that we got access to, and this is rare because Chinese police and Chinese law and order, they tend to be very secretive about the type of tools they use and how they use these tools. So that's kind of why we want to talk about this system. This system is called City Eye, and it's a system built by a company called CETC, which is basically Hikvision, the surveillance camera maker's parent company, and it's a big defense contractor, China's biggest defense contractor. And it actually CETC made some of the same surveillance systems that Josh was talking about in Xinjiang as well. So City Eye was run by a local Chinese law enforcement unit. They're not the police, but they're considered like junior varsity police. In Chinese, we call them chengguan, which is, like street defenders, city management defenders. The chengguan's roles isn't to catch criminals, for example, or find drug pushers. What they do is they see street hawkers who are unlicensed on the street, and it's the chengguan's job to clear these people away, to make sure the streets are clean, there are no cars parked illegally on the sidewalk, which in China is very common, or e-scooters parked on the sidewalks, or bicycles strewn, or sometimes shopkeepers who realize that they don't have enough shop space and they start putting their wares outside. It's part of the chengguan's role to clear off all this and just keep the streets clean and tidy. So the chengguan invited me to see this place, to see how City Eye worked in action. And when I got there, it was in a part of Hangzhou that it's part of New Hangzhou because of city sprawl. This particular district it's newly created and newly combined into Hangzhou. And there were a ton of migrants that came in from other cities into this part of Hangzhou. So for that reason, Hangzhou police and law and order people tend to be a bit more angsty because they imagine migrants coming in from the countryside or other parts of the city tend to create more trouble than their own residents. So when I got there, I saw this building. It's very nondescript. On the outside, it just looks like any beige exterior, kind of boxy, communist-looking apartment. So when I went in, it's nondescript on the outside, but when you went in, it's amazing what you saw on the inside. The City Eye control room was a wall full of plasma screens There were 12 at that point. Now it's greatly expanded. 12 plasma screens, and there were 3 staffers just watching and clicking on their computers. And what was on the plasma screens? It was the street scene outside. Some cameras were trained on the entrances of schools, other cameras were trained on the entrances of hospitals, and then some were just like streaming sidewalks. And I was like fascinated because 2019, you see a lot of this in the state media press, but you never see it up close, like how it works. And things just got more fascinating. The guy who was ushering me around, he basically sat me down and he was like, we're so proud of this system, and that's why we want you to see it. And I was like, okay, it's surveillance, and you're very proud of it, and you want a Western media person to see it, okay. And then he starts explaining why, and I understand. And he says, 2 years ago, we used to have really dirty streets, there's trash all over, and we didn't have enough people to enforce this. The way China does enforcement of streets is they break up neighborhoods into a grid-like fashion, so you'd have 3 law enforcers to one particular grid, and that's basically their turf. In the past, you only had these 3 people who worked like 9 to 5, kind of cleaning up the streets. Now the AI was a 24/7, law enforcement officer, and how it did it was the cameras were streaming what was happening on the streets, and the AI would recognize, okay, there's trash on the street, that's trash, or that's a car parked on the sidewalk where it shouldn't be, and it would flag it immediately to the Chengguan, to this unit, and the Chengguan officers could then act on it, regardless of the time of day and regardless of how busy it was. And typically, once they flagged it to the Chengguan had a way of doing it so that they didn't have to physically go down in person. They had set up group chats of everyone in the neighborhood. So imagine like your whole district on a WhatsApp group. That's what China has in its neighborhoods. So they would send the photo of the offender and the offensive car or whoever had laid stuff on the sidewalk and say, please clean this up. And then at you, so you're like publicly shamed and you have to do it really quickly. And that just made their job so easy. And I remember him telling me, I don't need I don't need that many people anymore. But I still have to keep them hired because, we need to hire civil servants. That was how much faith he had in the AI machine. And I was very impressed. And it just got better because if you know the history of the Chengguan in China, they're very detested. They're not the police, but they want to behave like the police, right? So they're big bullies on the street. They're like, you, clear this up. Or street hawker, which, street hawkers are typically the poorest in society, right? They already get beaten up, typically by society, and now you have a Chengguan telling them you can't sell your lamb barbecue on the street here and try and make a living. So it's actually resulted in a lot of friction between the community and the Chengguan. And it's resulted in also a lot of explosive incidents in China itself where, Chengguan have been beating local residents up. So what was amazing about the system, this guy in charge told me, was the system helped to ease up that friction. It had to help to ease up that tension between their unit and the community, because immediately, when the Chengguan goes down and tells you to clean it up, he has photo evidence of you doing it. So there are fewer quarrels, things are just more clear-cut. So overall, he was just raving about it. And I remember after that visit, I was thinking, I can't trust this guy because he's got his point of view, right? And it's in his interest to talk out the system. So I spent the afternoon kind of walking the streets, and I was talking to shopkeepers, talking to residents. I said, do you like the idea of a camera trained in front of your store? And I got, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. And there was a guy who said, my neighbor was hanging her laundry in front of my store. And, City Eye caught it. The Chengguan came and told her to keep it away. I mean, it just helped ease up even neighbor relations, right? So it was a overwhelmingly positive reception to surveillance, and that's when I was talking to Josh and I said, we have to write about this, right? There is another side to state surveillance that people don't know about. It's not always as sinister as it is in Xinjiang.
Well, I mean, that's a really interesting contrast between what each tried, and I want to push on that a little. One thing that strikes me just from the outset too is that both of you are describing situations that may not be available, certainly from someone in the near future. So I'm not sure. You said it was 2018 when you travel to Xinjiang?
2017 was the first time, and
2017.
then
I'm
went
not sure
back.
how you were able to get permitting even then, and probably they regretted it ever since, right? And certainly, if you tried to do something like that right now, absolutely would be. And then likewise, with city brain and the city brain operations, my guess would be, notwithstanding COVID, that probably access to something like that for a Western reporter would be, impossible. So one of the things that you get in this book is a really interesting insight at a moment when it seemed parts of China were still open in a way that they weren't, and that's a shame in terms of our own knowledge. But let me just pick on this contrast that you portrayed. I mean, how can we make sense of surveillance in China based on what you describe? I mean, what's the takeaway, or what's your takeaway as you think about these two very varying experiences? One of which, is fairly positive in terms of actually improving the way cities operate and holding accountable government agents, and the other, which is as dire and nightmarish as one can think of.
Right. I mean, I think what it boils down to is, it's sort of what the Communist Party has accomplished now, what is in the process of trying to accomplish, is the next evolution in state surveillance, right? So in the past, you've kind of had, various authoritarian regimes that have tracked their populations, mostly searching for dissidents, other rogue sort of problematic people, right? And obviously in the 20th century, the sort of apogee of this was the East German Stasi, right, who collected dossiers on tens of thousands of people that, if you line them up end to end, would stretch for something like 110 miles. So what the Communist Party is doing is, it's unique in a couple ways. One, in terms of scale, they just have, they can collect vastly more data than anyone else can collect, right? They have something like 400 million surveillance cameras now. Roughly half of all surveillance cameras in the world are in China. They have essentially unfettered access to data from roughly 1 billion smartphones. Mobile payment systems. Mobile payment systems in China do every year something like 10 times the global transaction volume of MasterCard. And the Chinese government can access all of that information one way or another. And it's just, it gives them an unprecedented view into human behavior. But what's also unique about what they're doing is what they are trying to do with it, the ambition that they have, right? So the Stasi wanted to crack down on people who oppose the East German regime. But China is much more sophisticated, right? Yes, it does want to crack down, and it does. And in Xinjiang, you see exactly what that looks like. And you're also starting to see it with COVID, which we can talk about later. But they also want to use it to make people's lives better. Ultimately, the Communist Party's goal is to stay in power. And even though there are not elections in China, they can't stay in power if everyone in China just feels oppressed and angry all of the time, right? So they want to use these technologies to sort of smooth things out for people, sort of give them a sense of security, of convenience, of predictability, that a lot of people find attractive. And they especially need to do this in part now, because the model they used to rely on for legitimacy was just delivering huge amounts of economic growth, right? Double-digit growth every year for 2 decades. And if you were a Chinese person, even if you weren't rich, you always had this sense that, if I can just time it right, I can get on the merry-go-round and I'll be just as rich as anyone else. And that's not really plausible anymore. China's second quarter economic growth was 0.4%, basically zero. And they know they can't deliver that level of growth forever. So this is essentially the new version of the social contract they have going there.
Yeah, I guess to summarize what Josh said as well, my view on state surveillance in China is that it really proves that state surveillance can be both very scary and can be very attractive. It's two sides of the coin, and it really depends on who you are. For example, are you a Xinjiang Uyghur or ethnic minority, and where you are. So I do think there's an importance of getting that out as well, because sometimes people ask me, what do Chinese citizens think about what's happening in Xinjiang? Firstly, they don't know. Like Chinese state censorship is just so great that everything, most of the atrocities in Xinjiang have been reported by Western media, and Western media is blocked out by the Chinese internet firewall. So Chinese people have really very little idea beyond like the Chinese government propaganda of what's happening in Xinjiang itself. And B, they don't see the downside of these systems because for the most part, they're benefiting from it, right? And unless you were living in a place like Urumqi, which is the Xinjiang capital, or Kashgar, where a lot of the Uyghurs are, you're not gonna see how these systems could work against you because in your daily life, it's making your life much more efficient and frictionless.
Thank you. I want to get to another point that sort of exposes a contradiction in your book, which is that, on the one hand, what you've described is a very eerie and chilling system of data collection that has as a goal the mass collection of information about the entire body politic, all the citizens within the country, as a way to kind of entrench and be able to know better what citizens are up to across a whole slew of different contexts. So fair enough. It's something that you've described as really cutting edge, that nowhere else have we seen this amount of sophistication and resources coming in. But then you have an interesting chapter later on where I think it's chapter 12, where you talk about the fact that it's not quite as good as it's cracked up to be, that the system actually has a lot of flaws, that it doesn't function in quite a unitary fashion as we would think, that there's fragmentation, layers of bureaucracy, and that there's a perception issue that is in some ways more important than the actual substance of what it's able to collect. Can you talk a little bit about this propaganda push and how to understand that?
Want me to? Okay. Yeah, so actually this was one of the other, so after, Liza sort of described like our first kind of big revelation. We were looking at this, that surveillance actually in some places can be pretty attractive to people. The other big revelation is the one that you described. And the way we kind of came about, or the way we sort of stumbled into this, is that once we discovered that there were, alluring, seductive uses of surveillance, we wanted to tell those stories, right? So we started scanning state media for stories of ways that facial recognition and other technologies have been used in sort of positive ways, and to try to find the people who had experienced it and interview them. And one of the most popular genres of state surveillance storytelling in China is the finding of lost children through facial recognition, because there's the one-child policy. Most families in China have only one child, and so this idea of losing a child is something that almost anyone in the country can sort of sympathize with as really terrible. And it does happen a lot. There's a lot of child abductions, especially of male children, and it's been a problem for years. And so this was like this grand technological solution. There was all sorts of stories about it. And one of the ones that we checked out involved outside of Hangzhou, there was a sort of new residential compound that had advertised, itself as, like one of the safest, like most high-tech, safe new residential compound in China, and it was all based on these stories of how they used these camera systems in the compound to find children who'd wandered off, or to find old people who had dementia and couldn't find their way home. And so we're like, perfect, like Liza was already gonna be in Hangzhou anyway. And so she like drove down the road to see it, and then, do you want to tell like it was.
Yeah. So I guess I can share my experience. So, because we knew we wanted to ground the book in real life stories. So when I saw this Hangzhou state media piece that, they had this whizzy, like futuristic system that was finding lost children and helping elderly people find their way home, I immediately went down to this compound, and I spent my morning and afternoon asking around, everyone who walked out of that residence, or I even went in and I started talking to the old people on the streets, and I said, who's been helped by this? Tell me. Like, it says like there's so many cases of missing children being found. Surely you've heard. And you would expect old grannies to know the most, right? Because they're all like, over summer, they're all outside and they're chatting and they're playing cards. And everyone gave me this quizzical look, like, what are you talking about? Those cameras, they're just in for like a month. Like, nothing. Oh, we don't notice them. So I thought, okay, this is strange. It's not checking out. And I asked the security guard. I thought, okay, if anyone knows, it's a security guard. So there are security guards outside every residence compound in China. So I went up to his booth and I said, hey, do you know about this system? Tell me about it, right? Like, who has it helped? Which family? He's like, huh? The system? That, I don't know. They just put it in. So I thought to myself, I'm not gonna give up here. I gotta find someone. You know, the state media says so it must be Bible, like gospel truth. Well, okay, famous last words, because so the final place I stopped by was the management office of the residence. And I went there thinking, okay, you know, the management would know. They installed the system. They would be able to tell me how effective it was. I walked in, there was a promotional video playing in the background about, you know, the system, and there was a lady who was like, oh, you know, my child, welcome home, and she was like hugging him, and it was playing on the video, and I was like, oh yes, that's the lady I need to find, that's her. So I asked the management office, I said, who is that lady? Tell me, I've got to find her. And she looked at me and she's like, oh, it was an act. We did it for the promotional video, just to let people know what it was about. And I was like, really? And then it hit me, right? Like, no one's checking these stories out. There are no fact checkers in a small residence compound in China. The state surveillance system doesn't have to actually work. People just have to believe it works, right? If you believe you're being watched by the camera on the street, you're not going to pee on the street. You're not going to toss out like that big box and put it on your neighbor's lawn, for example. So I mean, that was like the second big revelation of our book. The state surveillance system was more a propaganda system or was as much a propaganda system as it is like a tech and infrastructure project.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, you know, I mean, I think on the one hand, especially as we're talking about the kind of earlier divide between Xinjiang and, you know, mainland China, in Xinjiang, you really are pairing the technology with grid policing, with a really heavy boots on the ground presence. But, you know, it's probably, at least at this point, impossible from a resource perspective to do that in other places. So then it makes you wonder, well, how effective is the surveillance? To what extent is it being used to what we think and what we perceive? And I think asking those questions, I think, changes the dynamic a little bit in terms of our own viewpoints. Now, I'm curious, you have a chapter, one of your chapters actually focuses quite far afield to the United States. And you know, I didn't expect in a book about China's surveillance state to actually have a focus domestically here. And you also kind of mentioned early on that a lot of the roots to China's surveillance state can be found in kind of the post 9/11 policies that were in place. So I was wondering if you could maybe connect the dots for us here. Why that chapter, and sort of making sense of the kind of U.S. role when it comes to either whether it's a technology or pushing in place the policy that perhaps has laid the groundwork for the type of surveillance you're mentioning in China and in other places.
Right. So I mean, to be totally honest, the U.S. chapter was our publisher's idea initially. I mean, basically when we were selling the book, we were trying to sell the book. A couple publishers asked, is there going to be a chapter on the U.S.? And I think the idea was basically that, you know, a lot of Americans, you know, probably maybe don't care about surveillance if it's only in China, but they would if it's in the U.S. But you know, we looked into it, and I mean, it was a great suggestion, because I think, you know, I mean, I was shocked when most of the U.S. reporting was stuff that I did. I came here, and I was really surprised to learn the extent to which there is a lot of the same sorts of technologies being deployed in similar ways with similar dynamics in the U.S. Right? So, you know, a lot of facial recognition and a lot of the ideas about the use of behavioral data to sort of predict behavior or to you know, to use it in criminal investigations, actually born in the United States, and it was, you know, and a lot of that, I think, you know, was connected to. I mean, we'll get to the 9/11 stuff later, but like, yeah. So it was being used quite widely especially in New York. And the chapter we have is based in New York, and it follows the story of a guy who was arrested and charged with theft for stealing a package of TJ Maxx socks, and it was I won't get too deeply into it, but basically the public defender discovered that facial recognition had been secretly used to identify him, and it's secret in the U.S. because the technology is not yet accepted by courts as evidence in the United States. Because in order to do that, it has to go through a pretty rigorous testing, and a lot of the technology doesn't actually stand up to that testing. So the police they use it in the background, but they don't really they don't talk about using it, and then they sort of try to mask it by coming up with other evidence, which is obviously can be very problematic. But it was in New York. It's extremely common, and it is a legacy of 9/11. The NYPD has an immense sort of modern AI-driven surveillance platform that they use. It includes cameras, it includes facial recognition, it includes predictive policing, and it is subject to many more restrictions than the Chinese system, but still probably many fewer restrictions than I think most people would be comfortable with if they knew exactly how it was being used. And so I thought that, and then when you do look into the history of the surveillance industry in general, it was born after 9/11 because the war on terror created this huge market for advanced technology. It was the sort of first, there was sort of the 20th century East German model of kind of analog surveillance, and 9/11 really brought digital surveillance into existence and created the market. So you actually had companies the initial companies that started doing this work were all sort of feeding the war on terror. Right.
Profile
Yeah.
In the book. Initially to allow that to happen. So, kind of an interesting circle there. I want to turn to COVID-19. Obviously that's scrambled a lot of things, and within China itself, there's been a lot written in terms of QR codes that are used, and then sort of different tiers of colors that are associated with different individuals. And there's a lot of concern that this has sort of entered in a completely new paradigm shift when it comes to the acceptance of surveillance in Chinese society, and also a degree of effectiveness that at least through the kind of publication of this book had a lot of people looking with envy at China and saying, well, how did they do it, and why can't we do the same, and maybe we need better tools. Can you talk a little bit about the COVID, like what to make of COVID-19, maybe up through what you include in this book, and then we can talk a little bit after that about the kind of zero COVID implications since then.
Yeah, so I think for us, COVID-19 was a very interesting twist because prior to COVID-19, the state surveillance system in China had always been trained to recognize something that was visible, right? Is an object, be it a criminal or like, a getaway car or a trash pile. With COVID, China tried to turn its entire state apparatus towards detecting a virus, and a virus leaves no tracks. It's completely invisible, and it's way more, it spreads way more quickly than what the Chinese government used to call like extremist ideas, right? If they were looking for terrorists, they would look for terrorist groupings with their state surveillance. And with a virus, like it's so contagious, it's a 3-day incubation. You can spot evidence of a COVID carrier here, but 3 days later, so many people might have had it. So I think it gave us an interesting lens into how China was dealing with its issues using state surveillance, just dealing with a health problem using state surveillance. And the second big thing about COVID-19 was it helped everyone in China understand what being surveilled in Xinjiang was like. Because if you remember, Josh was in Xinjiang in 2017, 2018, and 2019, even up to 2019, we saw a lot of Western media stories about Uyghurs being tracked and followed using the facial recognition and other predictive policing systems in Xinjiang. The same systems were now turned on the rest of the population not to detect like terrorist ideas, but to detect, the virus. So your common Chinese person on the street now would have his cell phone data tracked. So where you were over the last 2 weeks, that's all tracked by the city government, and it's used to assign you almost like a health score. So what they have is what they call a QR code. Like it's a code you have to show whenever you enter somewhere, be it a building, be it a subway. And the code is either red, yellow, or green. And if it's green, that means you're given a clean bill of health. You've not been in any close contact with a COVID patient, or you've not been in a COVID hot. If it's red, it means that you have been with a COVID patient and a COVID hotspot. And the way they assess this is to track your cell phone data. So they look at your cell phone data over the last 14 days and determine which cities you've traveled in. And if you've been in a city for more than 4 hours, that's recorded in. And once that city has an outbreak, your health code automatically turns red. So it gave everybody an understanding of what it was like to be tracked 24/7, to have the government know where your movements are, like day in, day out. So that was the first one. And the second thing that really kind of struck out to me was in Xinjiang, like increasingly since 2016, you started seeing these security check stations that Josh was describing, pop out, where you had to flash your ID in order to get through, or you would walk through a metal detector, right? But essentially, like your ID would help you get through this kind of metal barrier, and they would scan your ID to figure out if you were a person of interest. If you were a person of interest, you would be detained. Similarly, over COVID, all these health check stations started popping up where you had to flash your QR code. And in this case, if your QR code was red or yellow, they would detain you and take you away. So there were so many commonalities that we saw happen. The surveillance that we saw happen in Xinjiang began to really spread out across China. So I think those two were the big takeaways for me. Do you want to?
Oh yeah, no, I think that captures most of it. The only thing I would add is that I think what happened with, despite the fact that it went from sort of, originally outside of Xinjiang, they mostly. The government mostly used state surveillance to target, it was like 7 categories of people, right? And it's like drug users, ex-cons, the mentally ill, potential terrorists, people who threaten social stability, which is a very broad category, of course, but it was still limited to, it was a limited number of people. And with COVID, it basically spread to everyone in the country. And so, people became aware of it. But what was really interesting was, we talked to people. One person in particular in the book, who was a woman from Hangzhou.
Wenzhou.
Oh, sorry, Wenzhou. But she lived in Hangzhou, and she had been in Wuhan early on, right? And during the outbreak, and had been tracked to her mother's house in Wenzhou. And then, when we initially talked to her, she was kind of upset and disturbed by how she had been tracked. Right, and she was and she was getting into fights with her friends over, her friends were like, "Wow, you're making such a big deal out of it. Who cares?" And she was saying, "Oh, this is like an invasion of privacy." But then we checked back in with her, periodically over time, and over time, as the death counts went up in the U.S., as like the virus spread around the world and it started, causing havoc, Italy, the U.S. and other places, her view started to change. And the last time we spoke to her, she was like, "You know what, I'm fine with it." So, yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. I would say, a couple things strike me. I think one, what Liza said about bringing the experience of Xinjiang to ordinary Chinese, you would think that over time that would have a pretty negative effect. Even if you're worried for a period about the spread of COVID, the deprivation that the experience in Xinjiang represents ought to lead to a collective backlash, you would think. And then the other point that you mentioned, particularly on that the story, is that now that some of the headlines are gone, and China seems to be experiencing some of the worst effects of its zero COVID policy, including lockdowns in Shanghai that are very reliant on this digital surveillance net to keep citizens in line, to a degree where we're starting to, I think, pick up lots of signs of dissatisfaction. Do you think that we're in danger of seeing a real popular backlash against, the surveillance systems, in part related to exhaustion with COVID-19 and perhaps an over-reliance on these tools?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really in a fascinating moment right now with China on this question, and it's for those who may not have been paying attention, or may not have been following it as closely, sort of China's maintained a zero COVID policy, incredibly strict. Earlier this year, they locked down Shanghai, the wealthiest city in the country, and people there were they weren't able to leave their apartments. There were robot dogs and drones flying around the city trying to spot people who were breaking quarantine, and a lot of people couldn't get food. And so we had this amazing scenario where the wealthiest people in China were starving and desperate and putting, and complaining about it on social media, denouncing Xi Jinping in some cases, which is just unheard of in China now. It was really quite dramatic. And so I think you're right. People are starting to wake up to the levels of control that the Communist Party has over them. And at the same time, I think that you ask, a lot of people ask, why is Xi Jinping and why is the Communist Party willing to stick with this willing to risk this policy, right? Which is cratering economic growth, which is unpopular amongst wealthy Chinese people. And I think one of the reasons is because they have these new tools, and they know they can maintain control. They have more control over Chinese society than they maybe ever have had. And so they can, whether or not you agree with this policy, Xi Jinping believes in it, and he feels that whatever the risks are, he's got systems in place now that allow him to kind of plow through with it.
Wow. Well, on that note, why don't we turn to questions from the audience? I have colleagues in the back with a microphone. I see a question in the front over here.
Thanks. I'm Josh Rosenzweig. I'm a longtime observer of Chinese human rights, and I have a question. It's been really fascinating listening to the conversation so far, and we started off with this metaphor of sort of two sides of the same coin, right? And you've got this, so by its very nature, you can only see one side at a time, right? The people in Xinjiang see one side, the people in Hangzhou see the other side. During COVID, you turn the coin around and people see the other side. I started to get a sense, but there was no sense, at least in the earlier part of the discussion, that there was much of a unifying governance strategy linking the two sides of the coin necessarily, at least in terms of what I've heard. Maybe there's more of this in the book. But at the end of the conversation, I really get the sense that you do see you may see a unifying governance strategy. And I'm wondering if you could, maybe beyond sort of just staying in power, dig a little bit deeper on that. And speaking of governance, I guess, my second part of the question is, if there is a governance, if this is tied, these technologies are tied to a governance strategy, how much of the industry in China is looking forward to export, and how much of that export, when will that export really start to take off? Thanks.
Right. Yeah. I think I can take the first part, and then do you want to take the export part? Okay. We do think there is a governance strategy here, and COVID has sort of scrambled it a little bit, but I think it fits into it, right? And what the Communist Party is trying to do with this technology is, I'll back up a little bit. One of the advantages democracies have always had over authoritarian governments is that they're more responsive to problems, right, or to changes, because they have institutions like the free press, elections, opinion polling, right, and these are all sorts of forms of feedback that leaders get whenever there's an issue. And so Amartya Sen famously, the economist famously observed, there's never been a famine in a democratic country, right? Whereas China the Communist Party presided over one of the world's worst famines in the 1950s. So this has always been an issue for the Communist Party. And they believe, if you read the sort of Central Party School research about AI, they believe that if they collect enough data and use it in the right ways, they can build a system that is more responsive than democracy, that will detect problems quickly and sometimes, theoretically, maybe even predict problems before they happen, right? And that can be, the ultimate aim, I think, is they want everything to be like Hangzhou, right? They want, they want the country to be wealthy, and they want people to be happy and sort of content in this kind of algorithmic bubble where everything is predictable and convenient, right? I think that's the end goal. That's like the utopian ideal that they're driving for. But they can still use these systems to, so in a system like that, you just don't have dissidents, right? Because everyone's happy theoretically, right? But I think they're they're realistic. They know that's not actually happening. And in the meantime, these systems are really good at sort of ferreting out people who don't agree with that vision. And in Xinjiang, that is what they're trying to. They are trying to predict who will become a terrorist, right? I mean, whether you can actually do that, or they're trying to predict people who will sort of rise up against the party, and whether that's actually I think that's possible to predict is a big question. I don't think it actually is, and the sorts of data that they're using to make those predictions, arguably are the wrong types of data. But that's their aim and their vision.
Yeah, and I mean, to your question on exports, we did look into it. The number I would point you to is actually not our own research, but the research of a scholar at the University of Texas. 80 countries, this was in 2020, 80 countries worldwide have adopted China-made surveillance systems of the type that we've spoken about, both the bad and the attractive side. And every continent in the world now has a Chinese-made surveillance system, except for Australia.
And Antarctica.
And Antarctica, sorry.
And Australia has surveillance, just not Chinese-made, just to be clear.
Yeah. But the reason why they're pushing this exports, there are two big reasons why they're doing it and why it's so critical. The first reason is actually to validate their own system for Chinese citizens themselves, because every time you saw the Huawei or Hikvision sell one of these surveillance systems to another country, very often with the Chinese government's help, with like condition-free loans, for example, to an African country to buy a Huawei system. Every time you saw that happen, it would be played up in state media. Particularly if a democracy adopted it, it would be played up in state media as like, oh, look at this big Chinese breakthrough, this big Chinese tech innovation that's beginning to pick up steam around the world. So that was the first point, just validating their own model for their residents. And the second point is, I spoke about Hikvision and Dahua. They're already the world's largest surveillance camera makers, and they're huge companies in China. They employ a ton of people. We know at some point the Chinese surveillance state is going to peak out. It's going to saturate. Like, it's got more than 400 million cameras right now and 1.4 billion citizens. That's a very, very high camera to citizen ratio. So we know at some point the Chinese government agencies are going to stop buying surveillance cameras. So who picks up that demand? So this is why exports are key, right? The export of the surveillance state and the export of this model, they need other countries outside to pick up the demand, that domestic, they need other countries to pick up the buying when domestic demand dries up. That's why they're pushing exports. Because of this reason.
Going to be a lot of takers. We can maybe go to one last question or two if there are, and then we'll wrap up. And I want to remind you we have book signings and refreshments outside after this, after we conclude. And right here, why don't we go with the final question?
Hi, I'm Charles Hutzler, and I used to work with Josh and Liza in China. I wanted, when you guys and colleagues in the Bureau were first reporting and researching on this, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I know you will. I think one sense that we got was that while Beijing's ambitions on surveillance technology were quite expansive, that actually the capabilities for analyzing and crunching all of this data lay heavily with the companies, particularly private companies. Is your sense that that has changed? Does the government now have the resources and the ability, or are they still heavily reliant on private tech companies to do this for them? And how does the whole crackdown on platforms feed into these surveillance ambitions?
Right. I think. What did you want to take this into? Okay. I have a few like unsophisticated thoughts, which then Liza will improve upon. But yeah, I think that's. Yeah, I think you're right. At the time when we first started this, and in fact, it's one of the most prominent salespeople for this idea of this model was Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, and we talk about this in the book. He was it 2016. I think it was 2016. He gave this huge speech to the Political and Legal Affairs Committee in China, which is in charge of security, and I think hundreds of officials, maybe even more, where he sort of sold this idea that Alibaba, we have this data, right? If a potential terrorist is on our platforms and someone is buying, like ball bearings and then fertilizer and all these different things, we have algorithms that can put that together and flag that to you, and so this is the new era of policing, right? It's a really prominent speech. The Minister of Security at the time, was heavily promoting it. So, and that was, they were relying very heavily on companies like Alibaba or Tencent, which is the other really large Chinese company, Chinese tech giant, which one's WeChat, which is the main sort of do everything app that you essentially can't live without in China at this point. But there was a crackdown. And I think the Communist Party's relationship with these tech companies has always been a little bit uneasy. Tech was like the one industry, is China's most innovative and successful industry. Is also the one really major industry in China that was not directly controlled by the Communist Party, where state-run enterprises were not dominant. And so there was always an uneasy relationship between the two. Companies like Alibaba and Tencent, they're profit motivated, right? That's what drives them, just like American companies. They didn't care about politics. They only cared about politics to the extent that they needed to, right? And so, this was in 2020. Do you want to tell the story of the tech crackdown from here? Or?
No, can you summarize?
Okay, so the tech crackdown was in 2020. Sorry, Liza's the tech reporter, so I just don't want to mess anything up. But like in 2020, Xi Jinping launched a crackdown on these platform companies, which sort of included canceling the IPO of Ant Financial, which was the financial affiliate, the online payments affiliate of Alibaba. And it was going to be, at the time, it was going to be one of the biggest, I think the biggest IPO in history. It was really, really heavily anticipated. And so when they canceled it, it was just like a thunderclap. And I don't think anyone had seen this coming at all. And as our colleagues dug into it, what we discovered is that Xi Jinping and the top Communist Party leadership got really angry at Jack Ma. They'd sort of been frustrated with him generally because he was so constantly thumbing his nose at regulators and running ahead of them, and sort of had like very little respect for them. And then he gave a speech at one point in which he sort of just openly derided them, and basically waved them off and sort of said, like, regulators just don't know what they're talking about. It's a very public speech. And I think that was that sort of, it encapsulated this tension between the party and tech companies. So the IPO got canceled. A bunch of other tech companies have also run into huge trouble. This includes Didi, the main car hailing company, Tencent. And so the move, I think, is now for the party to kind of take over that function, and they're trying to do it. And it's going to be a huge challenge, actually, because they don't have, unlike Alibaba and Tencent, which have really sophisticated, well-integrated data platforms, the Communist Party's data is it's scattered all over the place. There's different systems, different databases, controlled by different agencies, and they are trying to sort of now tie all of that together. And they have a whole infrastructure program now that's partly aimed at doing that. Whether they can do it as well is a big question.
Yeah, and I guess to follow up on what Josh said as well, the Chinese government might sound very sophisticated with these systems, but think of it as every other government in going on to developed country, right? You don't really have the talent in your staffing to be using really highly sophisticated computer systems. A lot of the talent still resides with private companies for a very simple reason. Private companies pay so much better than the civil service. So in terms of just the talent, having the digitized systems to do all this, they're just really at the cusp of kind of getting up to speed on these things. Like China has been wanting to announce, this big push into smart cities since like the early 2010s, but they've only really started to get on this like train, smart city train, at the end of the 2010s. Like the 2017, the 2018. Then you saw bits and pieces of the Chinese government system start to get digitized, files starting to get digitized, more functionalities moving online. So what I would say, Charles, is the intelligent part of the surveillance system is still in the hands of private companies. But what the Chinese government is trying to do is take over the infrastructure. So for example, in the past, they would have data hosted on Alibaba Cloud or Tencent Cloud. Now the Chinese government is trying to build their own government cloud, or host their own servers. So they're definitely trying to wean themselves off the tech companies, but when it comes to really kind of the more novel, innovative breakthrough stuff, or the more cutting edge technologies, the Chinese government is just not at that level yet.
Great. Well, with that, why don't we wrap up? The book is Surveillance State. It's a great read. Lots of fascinating, interesting reporting. Many new things I hadn't encountered before. They'll be signing copies, and you can purchase copies outside. We'll have refreshments there as well. So please join us, first of all, in thanking our authors for coming here. Let's continue the conversation outside.
Great. Thanks. Yeah.
What a nice, wide-ranging conversation.
Yeah.
So we're sold out at the tech crackdown part.
Oh.
You're like,